Welcome to the Ramchal School, the writings of the Amsterdam period between 1735 and 1743. Today, for this third lecture, I'm going to speak about Derech Chochmah, the way of wisdom, which was written between the years 1737-38. We're talking about a dialogue between a teacher and his student, which is a form already used by Ramchal in other books, like Choker uMekubal, the philosopher of the Kabbalist, and Datvunot. And this is an educational program divided in 4 parts. The first part is called Iyun Beilokut, the investigation of the divine. And according to Ramchal, this is the primary goal. Second to that, we have learning Torah and performing mitzvot, which according to Ramchal contributes indirectly to number 1, which is the primary goal. In third position, we have learning a trade, which is even more indirect than number 2. And in fourth and last position, we have superfluities and leisure, which according to Ramchal does not contribute to the primary goal at all. So I want to dwell a little bit on the concept of primary goal, which Ramchal calls Iyun Beilokut. It is very interesting because usually when he speaks about Kabbalah, he calls it a chokhmah, the wisdom, or a chokhmah kedosha. The question is then, what is Iyun Beilokut? Investigation of the divine or searching for God. Is it synonymous with Kabbalah? Is it not? Is it more philosophical? It's a hard question because we know that Ramchal was not supposed to teach Kabbalah when he was in Amsterdam. On the other hand, we know that he wrote some Kabbalah. His the first book that he wrote when he arrived there, Ma'amar HaChochmah, deals with Kabbalah. So the question is an open question. I want to say something about also the idea of having the investigation of the divine as a primary goal in education. This could have been the type of, on top of the list in any yeshiva, because in the yeshiva, as we know, people learn the Talmud and the codes. So the question is, who was it written for? And it seems to me that it could only be written for people, for a small circle or individuals, perhaps like the circle that Ramchal had in Padua when he was in Italy. We know there that he started with 7 people, and then they added a couple more, but really, when it comes down to it, it was a small circle and not a yeshiva. So the question is, were they students, disciples who were learning with Ramchal in Amsterdam? And if so, who were they? So I'll mention a couple of names, those that we know. The first one was called David Franco Mendes, who was a writer on his own right. He wrote also poetry and he even wrote biblical theater. He was a good writer, and he considered himself a disciple of Ramchal. As a matter of fact, when Ramchal went to Israel, he left a few manuscripts by Franco Mendes, and in 1783, Franco Mendes gave some of those manuscripts, including Derech Chochmah, to be printed, to be published in Amsterdam. Now, in the introduction to this book that was published then, Franco Mendes writes about Ramchal, Mori Luzzatto, Luzzatto, my teacher. He really felt very close to him, and there was closeness there. Because as we see, Ramchal left a few manuscripts. Another thing must be said about Franco Mendes is that we have the last letter that he wrote to Ramchal in February 1744, when Ramchal was in Eretz Israel. He was living in Akko at the time. And in that letter, at the end, he sends regards from a friend of his called David de Fonseca. I send him regards. He said actually that de Fonseca kisses your hands. It was very, both Franco Mendes and de Fonseca were very humble in front of Ramchal. As a matter of fact, before Franco Mendes signs the letter, he says that he compares himself to a worm in by the legs of Ramchal. There is another student that we must mention, and that was Yaakov de Chavez. Now, Yaakov de Chavez was the son of Moses de Chavez, whom we'll speak about shortly. Yaakov de Chavez was a close disciple of Ramchal. We know that because the last writing of Ramchal in Amsterdam was a play that he wrote for the wedding of Yaakov de Chavez. And as we know, there was a custom in Italy that people who were able to would write something like a play for a wedding for someone whom they were close to. As a matter of fact, in Ramchal's case, we know that he wrote such a play called Migdal Oz, the fortress, for the wedding of Israel Bassan, who was the son of Rabbi Ishaya Bassan, the teacher of Ramchal. So Yaakov de Chavez was very close, that we know for a fact now. And another thing we can mention about the connection is that before Ramchal left for Israel, in April 1743, he wrote a power of attorney for Yaakov de Chavez to take care of his affairs in Amsterdam. So those were the Talmidim, the disciples that we know about. If there were any more, we don't know. Perhaps the future will say. I want to go back now to the fourth part, which deals with superfluities and leisure, which have nothing to do, no connection to the primary goal, which is the investigation of the divine. And one of the things that Ramchal mentions is fancy foods. And in that respect, I would like to quote again from the traveling diary of Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, whom I mentioned in a previous lecture. Rabbi Azulai was in Amsterdam in 1778 during Purim, and he describes a banquet in which he was invited, and he talks about a cake that was there on the table. The cake was about, as he says, 80 centimeters high. It was made all of sugar, and it was a representation of the palace of King Achashverosh in Shushan HaBirah. And it also was painted in interesting colors. And he says there was a bench on the side where Mordechai and Esther were sitting, dressed in Persian fashion, and not far from them there was a Haman that was laying on the ground, and the Chida says that this cake actually was worth a small fortune. So that's definitely a case of fancy food, which we know Ramchal would not approve of. He also speaks about leisure trips as superfluities or anything of the sort. And in that respect, I would like to say something about Moses the Chavez, who was the father of Yaakov the Chavez we spoke about just now. He was the richest Jew in Amsterdam. How do we know that? Because we see on the list of the income tax, he's on top. He's the one that paid the most income tax, and he was very wealthy. Now, he actually showed his wealth. We know that he had a mansion. We even have a drawing of it. And in front of the mansion, there's a garden in the French style, which means that all the bushes there were cut in a very nicely, in a geometric manner. We also happen to know that he was an art collector. A few years ago, I found that he actually owned a painting of Vermeer. Together with that, he was also a member of an exclusive learning club, which was called Mikra Kodesh, and we know that he was also a learned man. But that lifestyle of living in a fancy mansion and collecting art, we see that it didn't fit with the Ramchal outlook on a proper education. As far as he was concerned, this was not contributing to the understanding of God and His creation. At the end of this little book, Ramchal gives a list, actually, of books, of disciplines that they were learning, or they were supposed to learn in Amsterdam at the time. And of course, we have, in that order, we have Bible, we have Mishnah, Talmud, the codes, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch. And then we also have logic, rhetoric, and poetry. So logic and poetry I'm going to put on the side now. I'll deal with that later when we speak about those books. But I want to say something about poetry. One of the rabbis who came to Amsterdam sometime by the end of the 1600, around 1680, was called Shabtai Bas. And he described in one of his books the learning of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam. And he relates to the fact that they were learning poetry. And he was very amazed by it. He said that when the students went home after a day of learning, many of them had a private tutor who would teach them poetry. And that to him was like an amazing thing. And in that respect, I want to say that this is something that was very peculiar to Portuguese Jews. As a matter of fact, there was a rabbi called Shlomo de Oliveira, who passed away in 1708, I think, who was a prominent teacher, and he wrote quite a few books. He was an educator, and he wrote books for the students, which were like dictionaries of rhymes, and that is indeed quite amazing. And he started himself as a preacher in the community. Then he became a teacher in the Talmud Torah, and at the end, he was the head of the rabbinical court. So think about this. The head of rabbinical court, teacher in the yeshiva, who writes dictionaries of rhymes. This is something that was definitely unique to that community. And since we're speaking about poetry, I would like to finish this lecture with Ramchal's relationship to poetry while he was in Amsterdam. It is true that when he was there, he was in exile. He had left Italy and he came to a different country. He was integrated in a community that was not his originally, but to a certain extent, we must say that he must have felt some comfort being with the Portuguese, because as we see, they were very involved and they liked very much literature and poetry. And as we've spoken about before, his closest disciple, Franco Mendes, was himself a writer, so he was in the right environment, and I think he adapted himself very well in that sense. And so much that in 1739, he wrote a liturgical poem called Le'el Elim for the holiday of Simchat Torah. And for the occasion, this poem was set into music by one of the members of the congregation who was a composer, Avram de Caceres, and they sang it during for Simchat Torah. It was sung by the cantors. Of course, they couldn't play music because it was Yom Tov, but there's also like an instrumental version with the songs. And Franco Mendes reports in his history of the Portuguese congregation in Amsterdam that when that poem was sung in the synagogue during Simchas Torah, people were very moved and impressed. And I will finish with that detail. That poem was actually printed in subsequently in at least in one or two of the Sidurim, the Machzorim of the Sfaradim in Amsterdam. So that ends today's lecture, and I would like to invite you to follow us up on YouTube for our next lecture, which God willing will be coming soon.